Welcome to Telltale Books. I'm starting yet another new author series. Well, not a new author, but a new series of an author that I think is definitely worth exploring, even though she didn't write a huge amount. She is one of those 1950s female science fiction fantasy authors who did really great work, but tend not to be remembered so well today. Mainly because she did not write nearly as prolifically as, say, Philip K. Dick. You know, there are months when there are 4 or 5 Philip K. Dick stories appearing in different magazines that 1 month in the 1950s. For this author, you don't have that happening. But she did write a bit, and she kept writing right up to the end. She died in 1997. She was born in 1918. Her name is Mildred Clingerman. Originally, her maiden name was Mildred McElroy. And she married a guy named Stuart Clingerman in 1937 and changed her name, of course, to Mildred Clingerman. So she was born in Allen, Oklahoma, but lived most of her life in Tucson, Arizona. So she's one of those out west writers. Seem to be quite a few writers in Texas and Arizona. Quite a few of the writers that I'm interested in anyway. And definitely what prompted me to want to explore Mildred Clingerman. Number one, she wrote some really excellent stories. Number two, she is a female writer from a time when there weren't that many women writing science fiction. It was, percentage-wise, more men than women. But she is one of the group of female writers from that time period who have proven that women could definitely get published in the science fiction fantasy magazine market of that time. Mildred Clingerman primarily published in the magazine of fantasy and science fiction, starting with her very first story, which I'll talk about in this video, called Minister Without Portfolio, published in the February 1952 issue of the magazine of fantasy and science fiction. It's a very short story, and her first story, but a lot like Judith Merrill, who likewise made a huge splash with her first short story, That Only a Mother. Mildred Clingerman made a big splash in the genre with her first story, Minister Without Portfolio. And I've read this story before. I just reread it earlier today in preparation for doing this video. And it holds up as a very excellent story, one that I give top tail status to. It is a classic and a must-read. The story focuses on a grandmother, older woman, kind of simple, not distinctive, living in a small town, wooded area, has grandkids, has her daughter around. Her daughter keeps trying to drag her out to do stuff, but she really just wants to sit home and knit doilies. Her daughter really doesn't like all the doilies around, and she usually makes them disappear. At various times, her daughter drags her out bird watching in the local woods, and she goes, but she brings her knitting along in her bag, so she's out in the woods knitting another doily. And on this particular day, she's out in the woods and she's walking, and she sees this young man in the distance, and he's wearing a uniform. Now, important point here is that this woman is colorblind. I mean, totally colorblind. She doesn't see any colors. She sees everything in black and white. There are some people that are colorblind, but they can see certain colors, just not certain other colors, or certain colors will appear to them as a color other than what it really is. But no, this is full color blindness. She sees everything black and white. That is an important point to the ending of the story, which I won't spoil, but if you read it, remember that when it's mentioned that she's colorblind, that is important. So she sees this young man, and he comes up and oh, that's right, she was chasing her hat, which had blown away. And that's when she runs into the young man and asks him if he's seen her hat, and he points where it's down the hill a little ways. But he hands her his like armored helmet. And then he starts talking, and she understands him perfectly, and they have a conversation. He points out that he has an aircraft and a number of other young men in uniforms that are down by the aircraft waiting for him. And so they have a pleasant conversation. She thinks he's a really nice young man, and the young man is impressed with her. And she knits him a doily, finishes knitting her doily, and gives it to him, gives him a present. And they all go their own way. I have to stop because any further, and I spoil it for you. It's kind of a Twilight Zone style story, which was common in Galaxy and the magazine of fantasy and science fiction in the 1950s. A lot of 1950s science fiction fantasy stories have these kind of twist endings that became the hallmark of the Twilight Zone by Rod Serling. And really a lot of the stories that were published in Galaxy and magazine of fantasy and science fiction did get dramatized on the Twilight Zone. Like It's a Good Life, which we've already previously reviewed. So I'm not doing justice to the story. You have to read it. The woman is delightful, very well characterized. The story is extremely well written. It's short, so it's not a huge investment of time, but it's a wonderful story, and with a really good and upbeat ending, which actually in science fiction there's really not a huge amount of upbeat endings. There's a lot of downer stories in the history of science fiction and fantasy. Lots of dystopias, lots of nuclear wars, stuff like that. Lots of bad alien invasions. This story has an upbeat ending. And I think you will like it. I think this story is definitely a classic story that deserves to stand with all the rest, all the best that we have talked about here on Telltale, and which get published in the anthologies of the best American literature. This really should stand among that. It's an amazing story, and Mildred Clingerman was an amazing writer. So I hope you'll take time to check that story out. You can find the February 52 issue of Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction as a PDF for free online, or the story itself has been anthologized a lot. There are collections of Mildred Clingermans that contain the story. There are a variety of anthologies, including David G. Hartwell's The Science Fiction Century and the Mammoth Book of 20th Century Science Fiction Volume 1. And most recently in 2017, and this book is still available brand new, The Clingerman Files, which collects a lot of her short fiction together. I'm going to be going through Mildred Clingerman, starting with this, her first sold story. I'm going to go through everything I can get my hands on in order of publication and talk about them here, because she is worth remembering. She is worth talking about. I hope you'll come back and join me for those videos. If you've read Minister Without Portfolio, please leave comments. Tell me what your thoughts about it are. I think it's a very remarkable story that has an important message. And that's something I haven't gone into yet that I really wanted to cover in this video, is that this story gives the message that it's not the big famous talking heads that really make this world. The real world, the world that functions, the world that goes on from day to day, is the average people, like this grandmother in the story. They don't start wars. They don't cause people to go into poverty. They aren't the root of the big problems of our world. They are just ordinary people getting by and living together, getting along with one another. In many areas, even here in the United States, you can see that happening when you get away from the political groups, get away from the people with an agenda. You see just decent people living their lives and getting along with one another. And that is the real world. The politics is an illusion. The politics is a game that's played. The real world is people like this grandmother. That is the real humanity. And that is who should be looked at when you consider the human race and whether or not this world is worth it. Remember all the common people that are just living their lives and getting along and being decent. That's who our politicians should remember. That's who our politicians should think about. That's who our politicians should work for. Because they are the real backbone of this entire world. And that's kind of the message this story is sending. That when you look beyond the headlines in the newspapers at the average guy in the street, you see a world that is decent and good and functioning. So, a very important message rolled into a very unassuming story and put there in a way that isn't preachy, but makes for a really, really great short story. So I'll leave you with that, and I hope to see you in the next video.